Our second hour guest today is executive producer director Todd Grimes at DreamWorks, who's had a career that's touched music video, notably for the alternative band Toad the Wet Sprocket, as well as animation projects involving hugely successful properties that many in our audience will find massively familiar. I remember when I was looking through his curriculum vitae and found the name Captain Underpants, something that my son was immersed in for a large part, along with all of his friends. And while you're still smiling about that, I should note that Todd was also nominated for a Daytime Emmy for his directing work on the animated show Back at the Barnyard for Nickelodeon. If you're interested in how global animation works and stuff like that, you're in the right place at the right time. Todd Grimes, welcome to Office Hours.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Oh, well, we're delighted to have you. These are topics that we investigate all the time, and we're really excited to have your expertise for the questions that our audience will be asking. I understand you were born on the East Coast in Connecticut. How did you get involved in this stuff? Where was your travels take you?
I was born in Connecticut, born and raised, went to school out there, and I always wanted to get into animation pretty much all my life. You know, I always liked to draw, and I loved cartoons and movies and things like that. So I went to art school and interned while I was in school at an animation studio in Connecticut, probably at the time the only animation studio in Connecticut, and was fortunate enough to get a job there right out of school. But that particular studio was doing mostly like advertising type work. And things like for pharmaceutical companies and things like that. And I knew I really wanted to get more into sort of the entertainment side, like storytelling, animation, and entertainment. So I right out of the gate, I knew that I was, had to come out here to California. So I just, while I was working at that studio, I was constantly in contact with all of these studios out here in California. This was in the mid to late 90s, and just knocking on every door I could. It was a smaller world back then, and I finally got through one of the doors.
I have to interrupt though. I got a couple of technical questions as someone who comes from the animation background. So, what school did you go to?
Well, I went to CCSU, Central Connecticut State in Connecticut. And I majored in graphic design and illustration, which both things have obviously I've utilized in terms of animation, but there wasn't an animation program at that school at the time anyway. So I kind of sort of got very fortunate in that I kind of majored in graphic design because I never thought I would be able to make a living as like a comic book artist, which is what I kind of wanted to do. And
what was the first animation package that you learned?
That was Lightwave. In terms of CG, because I started at the studio that I worked at, we had the video toaster that was on the old Amiga computer. And there was a little button on there that said 3D, and the video toaster is where we edited everything. Right. But the 3D button opened up this software, and it had, a place where you can model 3D models and another place where you can move them around. And it was fascinating to me because this was, mid 90s when CG was sort of not as accessible to everybody. In fact, it was accessible to almost no one at the time, except, the big studios. And a computer to run it cost thousands upon thousands of dollars. So then the studio kind of evolved, and we kind of got away from the Amiga when Lightwave became its own piece of software. And I mean, I still use it today. I've been using it ever since. But I'm a little less hands-on these days, kind of than I was when I was an animator. Right. But yeah, that's kind of what I started on back there. And a lot of studios out here were using it at the time because it was still very, very much in the forefront of like visual effects and on television and things like that. And still is used quite a bit for VFX, but it's not like the industry standard anymore, Right. So
Toad the Wet Sprocket is a California band. How did you get hooked up with them for those music videos?
Yeah, it was kind of a similar funny story about sort of just being a pain in the butt. Because Toad the Wet Sprocket has sort of been a part of my life for my entire adult life. When I first heard like most people, I first became familiar with them on their third album, Fear, where they had the big hits, All I Want, namely. And then I got their album, and I couldn't believe like how much it meant to me, like how I was feeling when I listened to it. And it just blew me away. And I was a very young person at the time, 30-something years ago. And then I was waiting for a second album from them, and I went to the store, the Tape World store in the mall that I worked at, because I was
Tape
still
World.
Tape World, yeah. I was a cassette guy for way too long. Everybody else was transitioning to CDs, but I remained a cassette guy because my car, I couldn't play CDs in my car, and so I clung to the old cassette. But I went into Tape World, and I saw 2 other Toad the Wet Sprocket albums, and I was like, oh, they come out with more, not realizing that they were their previous albums.
And this was Bread and Circus and Pale.
Yeah, Bread and Circus and Pale. 80 and 90 and 89.
As a music director for an alternative rock station, those were the first ones, because we were playing tons of stuff from the deep tracks.
And helped define alternative.
Yeah. So it just, I sort of became obsessed with the band as they were just my favorite band. I mean, I was into other music as well, but there was just something about the music and the lyrics and the vocals, the harmonies and everything. It was just something like, I don't know, I can't explain it, but then I started following the band around like every chance I could as a young person, and I got to meet them several times. They don't really remember me from those days, but long story short, jump ahead 30 years. During the pandemic, Glenn Phillips, the lead singer, was doing a lot of live streams because no one could go anywhere. And he was doing them, all to raise money for various benefits and charities. But it brought all these fans together that were also trapped at home, couldn't, see live performances. And Glenn was doing like 3 a week. And it was sort of our fix for live Toad the Wet Sprocket or Glenn Phillips music. And in that, it sort of created this community of people who always kind of like saw each other at the shows and didn't really know each other to become sort of like really close friends. And then once the world started to kind of open up a little bit more, this promoter in the Bay Area, Casey Turner, he had been doing live private performances with Glenn, where he would come to your home or wherever you want it, whatever venue you want to play for like a private show. And just as things started to become kind of maskless again, and we felt more comfortable, Casey brought that back. And as soon as I saw that, I reached out and said I would like to have Glenn play here. So I did, and of course I chatted Glenn up the entire time, and I was like, I don't know if you remember me, but here's a bunch of pictures of us from the 90s. And the band broke up in the late 90s. It was the same year that I moved to LA. And I was sort of devastated, of course, but I lived in Studio City, and I started to go see Glenn play at this club called Largo right down on Fairfax. And I used to talk to him there too, but we were never really like friends per se. But I explained to him what I did for a living and told him I would love to be able to shoot, some of the shows and things like that. And once they started touring again, I would go to the shows and just kind of film them on my iPhone and then show them to Glenn. And he'd be like, yeah, that's cool. And I was just like, I could do it for real, because most venues don't, if not all venues, don't let you bring in real camera equipment unless you're with the band or you have a press pass or something. And the band was like, yeah, okay, if you if you want to, come on and shoot some stuff. And then they were re-recording some of their old songs with acoustic versions of them, like a studio acoustic album. So they're sort of like reimagined versions of some of their classic songs. And Todd Nichols, the guitarist, reached out to me and said, would you like to, we want to make a music video out of a couple of these. Would you like to come by and shoot us? And we're going to turn it into some music videos that we want to release during the tour, the upcoming tour. This was a few months ago. And of course I said, absolutely. Tell me when and where. And so that's kind of how that all came to be.
What did you shoot with?
We shot, most of everything is shot on Sony cameras. We used FX3, FX6, and an A7R for most of the shots. And then we also had, I kind of carry around a little travel Sony. It's like an A6700. It's kind of like one of the newer Alpha series Sonys. Crop sensor. So it's kind of affects the lens a little bit, but it's great because it's one of the newer ones, and the autofocus is amazing. It's really light, so it kind of feels almost like an iPhone. If you're trying to get, I use it a lot when the band's on stage because I can kind of maneuver really well with it. So you kind of use that one as like a backup or B-roll kind of camera. And then
what kind of spaces were you in? Are you're talking about shooting in clubs and things like that? That's always been a challenge for me because the lighting is so iffy, to say something nice about it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough because, the Sony cams are great, though. The FX3 I love because you can set, it's one of those things where autofocus, all the things that you normally don't do as a filmmaker, which is put it on auto instead of manual. It's like you have to do that. You get the auto ISO, and it handles it really well in low light without a lot of noise. So yeah, for the amount of movement you're doing and the amount of changes in lighting and the distance and all that sort of stuff, you do what you normally don't do as a filmmaker, and you just set the camera to auto and let it choose for you. And then you can kind of mess around with it in post. And, I shoot everything S-Log. So I have, the ability to make changes, color and
What's
otherwise.
your post process like for dealing with that? What do you use to cut on?
Well, I edit in Premiere, do all the video editing in Premiere. And I work with a couple of DPs, one of whom really likes to do all the color correction in DaVinci. And I just do a lot of color correction right in Premiere with, we have like some custom LUTs and things like that my other DP has created, that we use to kind of do like color timing. And then, sometimes you're doing stylized things for certain shots where you kind of want to break away and do some other unique stuff. So, most of it's like custom LUTs and some kind of like unique filters that we use.
I'm curious about, you mentioned the pandemic earlier and how that kind of changed your focus and things like that, and you were working on the animation side of the industry. Did that fare better, do you think, than regular production? I mean, so many regular productions shut down. Did you see animation continue to go? Because obviously you don't need that large gathering of people in one room to shoot things. What was your experience like through that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question because it was really, it was very beneficial to be in animation at the time, because I had just started producing a show at DreamWorks in the fall of 2019, and by March of 2020, we had almost no staff yet, just the writers and the producers. And I don't even think we had a director yet. And then, they were like, oh, we're going to all go home for 2 weeks, so because everybody have the ability to work from home and, and anybody that didn't, they would set them up with computers and things. So we did it. And then 2 weeks, as you know, turned into more like 2 years.
Yeah.
And by the time we finished that show, we'd produced almost the entire 2 seasons of that show completely remotely, if not, hybrid. So it was, at first, we were very nervous about it. But once we realized, and every production is a little different, but in our experience on that particular show, it worked out great. Everybody on the show did really well, and we all really kind of thrived. I felt like I was getting in 2 extra hours of work a day because I didn't have to drive. And we kind of proved that it can be done, as many other companies did. And because animation is kind of a thing where you, depending on the type of project you're doing, you don't have to, have practical cameras and be on sets and things like that. So it was a part of the industry that was healthy during a very unhealthy time in the human.
I remember
condition.
During the transition back in those days from cell-based animation into digital animation, there was a lot of stuff went offshore during that time. And I'm just curious, last thing I'll be curious about is, how did that work in terms of how much of the animation work you do is actually animated offshore versus in the U.S.? And as the pandemic let everybody work from home, how much of the workflow that you have now goes off to other countries and then comes back? And I'm really curious about the kind of jobs that are available for everybody who's listening to the show in this kind of area.
Yeah, I think, it's kind of shifted over time. And typically, most television productions, 2D or CG for the last many years, are done overseas. There are very few, I think, that are done here in the U.S. And of course that's because of budgets and things like that.
Sure.
But on the feature film side, it was kind of for a long time primarily the opposite. Very few films were done overseas that were U.S. based productions, but that is kind of shifting now, where more and more films are kind of being done in places like Canada or India. And some of the other overseas studios that have like amazing companies that do really great work. And sometimes it's always a budget thing, but sometimes it's a partnership thing or a tax incentive thing for the production or the company. DreamWorks, the last show I did at DreamWorks wrapped over a year ago. But while I was there, there were a couple of films being done at overseas studios, but many of them were done at DreamWorks on the DreamWorks campus, which I think everybody usually prefers because it's just kind of a little easier. But you do sort of gain a lot of knowledge by working with people from different parts of the world as well. So there's kind of benefits to both. Almost every production I've worked on has been produced outside the U.S. In terms of the animation. The front end stuff, the directing and the editing and everything is done in the studio, and then all the animation and lighting is done overseas, and then typically post it comes back to U.S.
Alex, you look, I had another question.
No, I think we can jump into the questions that we have here, and then we'll come back to it. I've got a couple more.
Dynamite. Alexander, do you want to dive into our first question?
First one's from Paul Wallace in Austin, Texas. Compare the animation process you use today with what you used in the early days and what you guess you will use in the future.
Are you
integrating AI type stuff in your animation work at all?
No, it's funny. It's funny that you asked that because, I'll get back to that question too. But regarding the AI thing, I'm not against the use of AI at all. In fact, I kind of want to embrace it because I feel like it's the future. I am, morally against the idea of using AI like in a bad way in terms of whether it's using stuff that you don't have permission to use because it gleans from things that already exist when it comes to visuals and writing as well. But I think it has many other benefits that are like germane to the filmmaking process, but it still requires an artist to utilize the tool. You can't just be someone who's not an artist kind of going like, well, I'll just type in, have a pig run across a field, and then you get this thing, and it might look great, but it's kind of like, well, where did that, if it's not done properly, it's an issue. But have I used it? No. And it was interesting because when we put out the last Toad the Wet Sprocket video, someone online did make a comment to saying like, interesting use of AI graphics or, something to that effect. And I was like, oh,
No.
I didn't say anything, but I was like, I'm the person who made this, and I can assure you that there was no AI used in this. But then again, I don't want to be that guy because I also don't want to, be like the AI hater because of it. I feel like a lot of people that when the CG thing came around, the people that shunned it, especially in the animation world, ended up kind of, being left by the wayside, and the people that embraced it, kind of kept moving on. But again, like I said, it's good and evil in terms of its usage. It has to be done properly, and you can't steal people's work, and you can't replace the human touch, so to speak, in terms of creating art. There's nothing that's going to replace. AI is never, I don't think, going to. I mean, maybe it will someday reach that level, but it's going to take some time, and it has to be done properly. So that being said, I won't negate it, but I also won't use it yet myself. I do use it a little in terms of, I think, for upscaling stuff. A lot of old photographs and things like that. I'll use software like Topaz, and it kind of like sometimes it works really well, sometimes it doesn't. But I've definitely used it for that, but that alone, essentially. And then to get back to the original question there, I think it was Alex that asked, there hasn't been too much that has changed other than it's gotten sort of faster. In terms of the process of writing and then going to story and then to layout, then animation, then lighting, compositing, final mix has pretty much been the same process. The biggest advent and change that I think happened during my career was sort of the paperless thing. It was very paper heavy when I started. When I started directing, we didn't use digital storyboards. Everything was done on paper, and the PA would have to carry a stack of papers to the copier, like Xerox them. And,
so real frame kind of notes or frame animation ideas would go on huge reams of paper. Yeah, and then they'd have to be scanned and put into the edit software. Unlike today, where we just draw everything on these Cintiqs and all the storyboards are digital, and you could even kind of put movement into them and put a little edit and sound into them. Whereas, when I started directing, we would have to, go into a room and pin up all the storyboards on a wall and with a stick and like act out all the scenes for the producers and the studio people. And some, I feel like I was pretty good at it, but there are some directors who just don't have that, personality, and they'd be like, oh yeah, and then he comes in and screams, and then, so sometimes I feel like it was not the best, but the things you can do now is we have, during the storyboard phase, the artist can even add in, if you've recorded the actors, the actual recording and put it in and show the rough storyboards as almost more like an animatic. So are you seeing more real-time kind of virtualized collaboration happening like that with the various stakeholders kind of touching the project as it goes along?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say real-time, but definitely faster.
Okay.
Because I would say it's even easier to make revisions when you're doing it digitally. And then, that was probably the biggest, and that also comes into play with the design phase and the development phase, because a lot of the art is done digitally as well. So there are some people that still like to do things on paper. I'm one of them, but it ultimately gets put into a digital form at some point. There are very few people still using paintbrushes and painting backgrounds and things like that.
Alex, you wanted to weigh in on this one?
Yeah. Couple things, a couple questions. So one is, I guess have you seen Unreal used in previs very much? Is it kind of coming up to speed?
Yeah, not personally, but I have friends who work more in like the game world, and some of what they've shown me has been amazing because it kind of looks almost like the final product.
Yeah.
And you know, every studio is a little bit different in terms of how they utilize that stuff. But I personally have not yet encountered using Unreal as like a story tool yet.
Right.
But I would love to because
it seems like it's, you know, the real time stuff is interesting. You know, because obviously I did previs for Star Wars, you know, in the 90s. So we were doing 3D versions of those. And David Dozoritz, who hired me, went on to do, I think, one of the first, you know, fully animated or what was it called? Safari? Anyway,
Jumanji?
No, it wasn't Jumanji. It was, I can't remember the name of it. It was a play on words, and I just can't quite come. But it was all I believe it was on Unreal. And it really got us thinking. Like, I'm amazed now that you can, like, if I want a facial animation, I can pick up my iPhone and sit there and turn it on and just do the facial animation. And I mean, it's on Unreal in real time. So from a previs perspective, I think it's really interesting. You know, I think that, I guess the question I had for you when it comes to like the remote, it sounds like you're now in a hybrid environment as far as that goes, as far as doing those, you're sometimes in the office, sometimes at home. Is that kind of how you approach it now?
Yeah, definitely. And like I said, I've kind of like switched gears a little bit since the end of the last show that I produced, because I've been doing sort of more of live action stuff, which is kind of like hybrid in that it's often mostly me in the studio here editing and working on audio and things like that, versus being out on a stage or in the field, practically shooting. And
you're in a pretty big space. How big? What are you shooting a lot of stuff there?
We shoot some, yeah. In fact, we do. We even shot some stuff like Captain Underpants stuff up in this room. But it's this like sort of loft area up here, and we've shot some interview stuff up here. Glenn's played up here like 3 shows up here. I've filmed all those, of course. So I kind of utilize this space as best I can, because it's also easier to control. Going to sites on site, you have to obviously bring all your lights and be in people's way for however long it takes to set up and set down and tear down. And of course, that always takes a very long time. But yeah, the studios now, I think, it's sort of about the hybrid thing. The majority of them are kind of preferring people to be in the studio because it's kind of good for collaboration. But many of them, after the pandemic, have still allowed the hybrid, like 3 days a week maybe, or 4 days a week you have to be in the studio. Some people remote because of where they live. So it would be probably, I like either. I like being in the studio. I like being around other artists and be able to collaborate. Because I get a little stir crazy just being in this studio here all the time. But I also like this because I can just get up in the morning, make my coffee, and start working immediately.
What are the specific tools that have made it easy to work remotely for you?
Definitely Zoom, and we use Teams, and a couple others here and there, like Cisco's WebEx. That obviously has helped quite a bit. And then sort of the speeds of the internet that I've got. I mean, we wouldn't have been able to do this probably even 10 years ago, I think, because depending where you were, and the size of the files that you need to transfer and things like that, it would have been nearly impossible. But yeah, we use quite a bit of Dropbox and quite a bit of almost all the productions I do now because I shoot some other stuff aside from the music videos and things like podcasts and things for nonprofit organizations. It's done almost entirely remotely in terms of like the transfer and the final deliveries and things like that.
Let's get to our next question. We've got a bunch in the queue for you.
Sure.
Yeah, this one's one of my questions. What are your thoughts on shooting a music video today with an iPhone 16 Pro in a rig?
Have you done any of that?
Yeah, well, it's funny. I think it's a great idea. However, I would need to be shown how cool it can work. I saw recently, a film that was said to have been shot entirely on an iPhone 15, and then you see pictures of it, and it's like an iPhone in the rig with this full-on, RE lens, and it's like, okay, well, that's sort of an iPhone. But actually,
the
I think
sensor was in the iPhone.
I mean, sometimes you can't tell the difference anymore. The thing for me, I think, is I don't know if you can get raw footage out of the iPhone, and the compression might be a little bit different. I have the 15, and I shoot everything on this phone at 4K 60, so I have full options to do anything. But obviously, color space wise, you can tell a little bit different. I guess you'd have to have a sound set up separately, which is the case with any kind of shooting, I suppose. But I think everybody should do it. I think it's a great tool, and so many people have access to it, and a lot of people have stories to tell. So I say, if you have the means, and you want to do it, you should definitely do it. And many people are not even going to know the difference.
Certainly an ecosystem that's growing incredibly fast. Next question.
Next one's from Dave Trotman in Edmonton, Canada. Did you ever dabble in stop motion animation, thinking Wallace and Gromit?
That makes me smile. What do you think?
Yeah.
Todd?
Absolutely, I have. Yeah. Well, when I did the Captain Underpants show, it was on that particular show. It was probably one of the coolest experiences I've had on a show, because every single episode of that show had at least one, if not two or three, sequences that were a completely different medium. The show was a 2D animated show, but we would do cutaways where we would either do stop motion, or we would do puppets, or sometimes it would be us in costumes, filming ourselves live action.
Oh, that must have been fun.
Yeah, it was a blast. And there was a lot of it. The greatest thing about it was the majority of that stuff we all just shot ourselves. Myself and the showrunner, this guy Peter Hastings, we had DreamWorks would give us a little studio space on the campus to shoot stuff like that. And sometimes it was small. Sometimes we'd need their whole mocap stage. But we did the majority of it ourselves. And then we had, and a lot of it was stop motion. And a lot of it I did animated myself personally, because I, wanted to. And then some of the bigger scope stuff that we did, we worked with Stupid Buddy Studios down the street from DreamWorks. And they do stuff in many types of mediums, but they primarily do stop motion, and they have full-on stages, and they do tons of productions, but probably most well-known for doing Robot Chicken. But they've done many other stop-motion shows like Crossing Swords and Super Mansion, and they're really prolific in the stop-motion world. So we got to, do a lot of work with them, and I've sort of kept all the props and stuff here, and once the show ended, because everybody was just like, I was like, what do you want me to do with all this stuff? And they were like, I don't know, throw it away. And I was like, oh, no. So I just took it all here. And my wife is
You're going to get a phone call to you to do a pickup or change something. I guarantee it. Next question.
Roscoe Jones in Madison, Indiana. What makes you want to work with a voice actor over and over again?
Oh, I'm not going to listen to this. Go ahead.
Oh man, it's going to be instincts, I think. Actors. I actually like to work with actors that I know, and and that I enjoy working with and I trust. But I also really love to work with new actors because, you kind of, there's that famous story of, Steven Spielberg suggesting to George Lucas that Harrison Ford play Indiana Jones. And George being kind of like, he's Han Solo, and I don't know, I don't want to keep using him. And there is a little bit of that in your back of your mind sometimes where you're like, I'm using the same people all the time. But at the same time, if they're right for the part, then it's hard to argue. And since I've worked primarily in comedy, for me, it's been mostly sort of like acting instincts for the role. And also, of course, like comedic timing and the sound of their voice when if it fits the character and things like that. And some people would surprise you. You'd be like, he's never going to work for this role, or she's not going to work for that part. And then you try them out, and you're like, I was so wrong about that. But yeah, I would say probably comedic timing and acting instincts are probably the most important.
Next question.
From Mickey Macajor in the Philippines, Manila. For animation, how much impact does recording dialogue with the talents together at the same time have for you? How crucial is it, or are you okay doing individual sessions?
That's an excellent question, and it's sort of one that I've talked about quite a bit with my colleagues over the years, because it's, sometimes you don't have a choice. When I did a show at Lucasfilm, the cast was enormous, and many of them were sort of really busy actors who were on other shows. It was almost impossible to get them all in the same room at the same time. So that show was, I would say, probably 80 to 90% all done individual recordings. And what I liked about that was sort of maybe the speed at which you could go. But what you really miss is the actors playing off one another. And I really enjoy the ensemble room because you'll end up getting things that maybe are off script that are brilliant or just fun and things you hadn't thought of. Because actors are storytellers too, and they'll make it better, especially when they start playing off one another. Sometimes they give you stuff that's so good, but it's way too long to ever use. So they start having fun, But I prefer the ensemble in a room, but I'm also perfectly okay with doing the individual side. So I think there's pros and cons to both. But I love having actors work with one another, and I think they enjoy it as well. And sometimes you have to get pickups when you do it individually because the response that one actor gave from a line when the other actor hadn't recorded yet, and then you put them together and it just doesn't fit. So someone has to adjust their performance. You might find that happens more often with individual performances. So. Like I said,
do you think the ubiquitous nature of these kind of Zoom meetings might help that in the future, where you gather a group of talent together on Zoom and latency gets smaller and smaller? And I know in the audiobook world, and I'm playing a little bit in that area now, we're seeing more collaborations, 2 or 3 people getting together to work on a similar project. And it seems like it's getting easier. Do you have hope for that?
Yeah, I think we've actually sort of did that already a bit here and there. And I think it's better than not doing it, but I still, and I think it's definitely doable, and I'm totally happy to do it that way as well. But I think it's still kind of better to be in the same room because you tend to, the actors when you're looking at sort of the Brady Bunch Zoom kind of thing, you might not be seeing, it's just when you're in a room with someone, you're just looking right at them, or, you're probably reading off your script at times too. But I think it's better. That's a better method than not doing it, but it's still probably better in person.
It always felt that way to me. When I started my career, all the ensemble work was in a studio, in a room. And you're right, that body language and eye contact and what's your timing, I can see you leaning into that. it's a different kind of a beast. So I agree with you 100%. I'm just hoping it gets a little bit better because, as you noted, it's impractical sometimes to get so many people together in one place now.
Yeah.
Let's go to the next question.
Douglas Carmichael asks, have you ever explored open source software like Blender?
Has a big reputation. Yeah.
Yeah, I've played around with Blender. I've kind of done some tutorials and stuff with it online because, the thing about the Blender community is, you can download the software for free, and then there's a lot of tutorials on the web, so you can learn it pretty easily. I've never used it in an actual production, but my son, who's also interested in sort of like animation and film, has used it quite a bit and played around with it and, done some of the tutorials. So I think it's a really cool piece of software, and it really works really well. And the fact that it's, like you said, open source, it's wonderful. But I would love to see maybe it used in something kind of commercial. I've never to date used it for anything other than just my own private usage.
Next question.
Roscoe Jones in Madison, Indiana. Are you mostly taking your timing from the voice actors? What else in the animation might be altered based on a voice performance?
What's the usual process?
Yeah, definitely. All the acting and all that comes out of the actor's performance. The written page, you hear the voice in your head, and especially as a voice director, when you're directing the actors, you kind of tell them what you're thinking, maybe you wait to see what they come up with and then adjust as needed. But the actors take your words and kind of give them life, and their performance is what really defines the character. And at most of the productions I've done for the last many years, we put it into the schedule to try to record the actors before we even do the storyboards. Doesn't always work that way, honestly, but because there's schedule concerns in terms of timing or whether or not you can get an actor. And then sometimes we'll temp in the voice and hope that that we're good at it. But when the storyboard artists can hear the actor's performance, they can imbibe it into the drawings, which then, of course, the animators utilize as reference. So it's all about those actors, and they're so good, and it just makes when you write a script and then you hear it performed, it just puts a big smile on your face.
Todd, how much time do you spend allowing for the actors to do those ad libs to see if you're going to get something special? I remember I was talking to, I think, Glenn Ficarra, who's the director of Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, and he was talking about how much they let those actors just, take after take after take to see if something magic happened, and then they would piece together the best parts in post. Do you work like that, or do you have the time to?
Sometimes, definitely, it's always tried. And in animation, oftentimes we have a voice director. So I've worked on several productions where, as the supervising director or producer, I voice direct the actors myself. And then I've also worked on productions where there's a voice actor, like that's sort of their focus. And on the last show I did, the voice actor would always let the actors, kind of go off book. And sometimes some people call it like the crazy pass. We'll try to get at least one. You always got to get one on script. But just in case. But then you kind of let the actors go. But in terms of how much you can do that, there is always a time concern. Some actors, I've worked with a few that, get a little carried away, especially if they're simpatico with one another, and they just, and you kind of have to rein it in a little bit, but you don't want to, be Debbie Downer, party killer, but but yeah, you have to consider the schedule, but you also don't want to squash their sort of their creativity on it. And sometimes you get those gems. A lot of times you'll get the funniest thing you've ever heard, but it's unusable because there was like some sort of swear in it or something like that.
Oh,
but
yeah.
That's sort of understood. That's just for our ears only, you know?
Yeah, that was interesting when I was talking to Glenn about that. It was that process. He was saying sometimes the line is brilliant, but the tonality that we're going to build in this scene, it just doesn't fit. So you end up throwing away even gems that might in another circumstance have been really elevated the program, but you can't use it because of what it sits against.
Right.
So yeah, what you're saying really resonates with me. And also in commercials, we try to do the same thing. Do an unleash take, just whatever you think is, and maybe 20% of the time it works out, but boy, the 20% of the time it works out, it elevates the whole spot and makes everything better.
Yeah.
Let's go to our next question.
From Douglas Carmichael, where do you see the role of AI technologies in the production pipeline of the future?
Ooh, it's a sore subject. I know I talked about it a little bit earlier in the show, but
then where do you imagine it going, and what would you like it to develop into? What's your preference?
Yeah, I think it's really tough because I want it to be utilized as a tool that an artist can have at their fingertips to inspire them or make their job easier, not necessarily make their job irrelevant. Because I think right now I don't think we've gotten to the point yet where it can do acceptably what everybody wants it to do. And by acceptably, I mean there's a lot of things that it can't do that a person can do, like, you know, truly, you know, put that real human touch on it. And as an artist, you know, art isn't really, it's not just a concept, it's a passion. And, you know, and something that's artificial by name, I don't know if it can have passion. So I think it's a dangerous place to be where it starts, where people start thinking that it can replace an artist. I don't think that that's what anyone should be focused on. But, you know, I know that when it comes to things like budgets and stuff, people are kind of focused on that. But that's kind of the case with any new software tool, even if it's on the production side. But I hope that it could be, like I said, something that could be used to inspire people, or they can utilize it with their own art as the root, not taking from someone else's art, you know. You know, like, I think if you have like a concept and you've started it and you just want, you know, to see like some options, like, oh, and then you work from there and make it better, you know, that kind of thing. I think that's like maybe a more acceptable usage of the technology. But again, I don't think that I think there's a misconception that it's going to be like, oh, you don't need storyboard artists anymore because you can just type in the computer, guy drives car past a building. But like, is it gonna know like how much, what about the staging, and what about like there's certain choices that are made by people who are good at this type of work that someone who's just typing it, has a generic idea, can't do. So,
Alex, you had a follow-up?
Yeah, have you played with it much with like brainstorming? Like I find that for me, you know, I don't use any of the stuff that I generate. I use it in presentations. So if I want something, like a lot of times I want a funny photo or I want a funny image. It doesn't have to be precise, but I want, like, I had one where I had like, I said 3 people looking confused over white in the style of Pixar. And I get these like 3 cartoony characters kind of like looking like confused. I'm not using that for a project. I'm just putting it in as a funny slide. But what I do find interesting is one of the things that I've kind of gotten into is this I have a very, you know, I'll take a very short prompt with almost no instruction and set Midjourney to 100%, like just go crazy and then just ride through it. Now, I feel like that, what I'm curious about is your input on it, but I feel like that's kind of like a director asking someone to go, you know, like make a bunch of concept stuff, a bunch of ideas. I'm not going to use any of them other than, you definitely get with Midjourney, at least, you definitely get, oh, I didn't think of that.
Sure.
and some of them are in a horrible way, like, you know, and some of them in a good way, but it'll go all over the place, and it lets you kind of brainstorm. Have you thought, I mean, what are your thoughts there? Because it's not using that content, but it is letting you, it's like, to me, it's like, we used to take Archive magazine and cut it all up and put it all on our walls of like mood boards, and like, this is the kind of feel that I'm feeling. Yeah. And now I'm just creating that from scratch.
Yep. Yeah, that's an excellent point, because, you know, that's something we've done quite a bit over the years. Something I've been asked to do, like, you know, can you come up with a proof of concept for this idea? And several years ago, there was a studio that said that we have this idea for a film, and we're considering you as the director. So can you come up with a proof of concept? And here's the basic, you know, here's the premise and here's the Bible or whatever of this idea. So yeah, I went out and I just grabbed footage off of the internet from like different movies and put it together into a reel. And it wasn't, of course, like I was ever going to use that. It was just like you said, like maybe creating vision board stuff.
But I will say that, like, as someone who worked on like Ben-Hur and the pod race look very similar.
Yeah.
You know, like, so, I mean, there's very similar.
Is this inspiration?
And then like the bombing, you know, the whole attack on the Death Star is all
dogfights.
The attack on the Death Star is all about the bombings of these German. It was, I can't think of the name of the movie, but it was, they had to bounce these bombs along. They were trying to blow up a dam, and they had to bounce it, and they had to line up their sights to two towers that were on the. So the whole sighting thing was all because they had to line up at these two towers on the dam. Yeah. And as soon as it lined up, they calculated if you dropped it right then, it would, you know. A lot of the dialogue is similar.
Pretty similar, yeah.
So so when we say we can't copy, like AI is not copying, I'm kind of like, well,
you're quoting. You're quoting.
Well, I think for development, I don't have a problem with it for development, not at all. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, especially if you're just kind of, you know, maybe you're a writer with a concept, but you're not a traditional artist. You know, and you need to just kind of have something to show someone kind of what you're thinking. I think that's, you know, okay, because you know, it's work product, if you will.
Right. 100%.
But using it in production is a different thing. But yeah, I mean, there's the famous reel of, you know, the old Star Wars where it, you know, before they shot all the X-Wing stuff, George just had a bunch of dogfight footage in there, like of old World War II planes and stuff that he'd gotten from some other films or war footage or something, you know, and it's the same idea. It's been done for years. In that regard, yeah, I think it's a great tool, and I've used it too for research. You know, if there's something that I don't really know about, I'll ask the thing to, you know, I'll say like, what's, you know, can you tell me about this or whatever, and it gives you a lot of stuff that is more concise than just doing like a Google search. Yeah. And, you know, and then you kind of use that and make what you will with it. But so it's not like, again, that's why I say like I'm not against it by any means. I'm just sort of cautious, like with its usage at the moment.
Yeah, 100%.
You're using it as the footage equivalent to a mood board, which advertising and other things have been doing for decades. I mean, everybody has to communicate somehow, and that's a great shorthand for communicating the kind of feeling you want out of something.
Absolutely.
We have one more question.
Dave Trotman in Edmonton, Canada asks, do you have any scars from the days of Flash animation?
Did you ever have to use Flash?
Did I ever? No. I mean,
I didn't miss anything.
Yeah. I mean, I remember it was kind of a thing when I started, but I kind of jumped right into the CG world. So I kind of bypassed that altogether. But I used, I mean, we had it at the studio. And I think we messed around with it, but that was many years ago. So definitely no scars. I just remember
it's the biggest resource hog in the world. You'd launch Flash on your machine, and it would just eat up cycles over and over and over again, to the point where everybody I knew kind of tried to get it off their machines as quick as possible.
Sure.
Todd, it was a pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you for letting us know everything. Is there anything you haven't covered about your past or your future or something like that you wanted to mention before we wrap things up for today?
I don't think so. I mean, hopefully, things, the primary reason that I've sort of switched gears a little bit is that, the industry's gotten a little bit rocky with the advent of things like the uncertainty of AI and strikes and things like that. So I kind of went for different avenues to fill in the blanks, so to speak, creatively. I'm sort of looking forward to getting back into animation and producing more animation. And in the meantime, really looking forward to hopefully to continue to work with the band, and hopefully there's more on the horizon for working together with them, because I really enjoy it, and it's sort of a nice change of pace for me. So,
people want to reach out and connect with you. How do they find you?
I'm on Instagram, and I'm Todd Grimes. I am Todd Grimes, and like I'm as in I am. And then I'm on Facebook, although I don't really use that so much on the business side, but yeah, that's the best way.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much for being our guest today. It was fabulous to talk through some of these things with you.
Well, thank you so much.
It is time for us to say our thank you to our producers, to all the people who added questions into the show today, and for doing that every single day. They're one of the three focuses of our triangle of people who make this show possible. The producers are very important, because without their questions, the show doesn't get driven forward. The next leg of that are our panelists, who show up every day to add their expertise and answer your questions. Every day, a group of fabulously talented and very smart people show up here to help everybody get their problems solved as much as we can. And to our incredible back-end crew who manage everything that goes out on the web. We've been doing this for 1,600 plus. I think it's probably 1,650 plus by now. I haven't looked at it lately, but that's a lot of shows. And everybody shows up here every day to make this happen, and we couldn't do it without everyone. So back-end crew, our hats off to you once again. The Talk Traversal today, that's 77,000 miles is how far we would have had to go to talk to the people who have appeared on the show today. It's 124,000 kilometers, or 611 million bananas for scale. That's going to wrap things up today. We will see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
That was great, Todd. Thanks for coming
Great. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Yeah, lovely to meet you.
Yeah, but you too. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me again. It was great.
Yeah. Can't wait to see what else you do with the band.
Yeah, we've got some more coming out, but I'm not sure when, because their people kind of do the scheduling for that. They just tell me when to give it to them.
Right.
But yeah, and then hopefully beyond that one.
Yeah, I tried to get Glenn to let us, when they came up here, I tried to get him to shoot Spatial, but he wasn't ready yet. He was just like, oh, I guess it was the first show on the tour, and he was.
Yeah. We shot that show, so yeah.
Yeah, we got the Verve pipe. I got persuaded.
Oh, cool.
I didn't have to do much persuasion. Brian's always like, yeah, sure, let's do this thing.
Right. That's great. Yeah, I saw them just in Santa Barbara with, that was Temecula.
Temecula, they're
a couple weeks ago. Yeah.
I told Brian, great. I was like, you got to tell Glenn that the Spatial thing is great. Like, we got to get Toad the Wet Sprocket on. So
Glenn, he's not like,
he's pretty careful.
He